who cares? After all, who among us besides me is still receiving anything from our jolly fat friend sleeping up north? Well, on a more serious note, what if I told you that according to a study done by the Journal of Climate, by 2050 temperatures are expected to rise by 5.4 degrees and sea levels by 0.3 meters. Let's remind ourselves that during the last ice age, average temperatures were only 7 degrees lower than what they are today. Odds are, you'd say you're a little concerned now. But not really. If I ended this speech right now with a desperate plea for all of us to reduce our daily energy consumption for the good of this planet, I should expect nothing more than fail. And that's fine, because there's a good reason why. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And to see this phenomenon at work, you need not look any further than their very own lunchroom. Why is it that if I show up 3 minutes late for lunch, there aren't any freaking brownies left? Well, since the brownies belong to nobody, or everybody for that matter, you are best served taking 7 just in case. Because if you wait like I do, you risk there not being any left. That same line of rationale goes for explaining why we don't clean up after ourselves, no matter how many times Mr. Burgersi gets up here to rant at us. Why should you bother cleaning up your vomit after trying to stomach those 7 brownies you knew you couldn't eat, if you can just wait for someone else to do the job for you? Now, this is a stretch, but if we imagine that the brownies represents Earth's resources and that the mess we create at lunch represents man-made pollution, you will come to realize why our environment might be falling apart. So, what do we do about this? Are we done? Are we going to need Wally to save us? Probably. The problem, of course, is convincing people that they need to care. Classical economics will tell you that there are 2 approaches. We can either persuade people or coerce people to go out to save the environment and reduce their non-polar bear friendly practices. In terms of actual policy, we see this in the form of government subsidies and regulations. The idea is to create a financial incentive for people to produce ethanol or to generate less toxic waste. But do these solutions actually work? Yes. But an emerging new field of economics, known as behavioral economics, suggests that we can do much better at substantially reduced costs. Let me explain. In his work, Predictably Irrational, Dan O'Reilly, one of the forefront professors of behavioral economics, argues that classical economics relies on 2 fundamental assumptions: that people are always rational and act in their self-interest. Unfortunately, these assumptions often poorly reflect reality. Behavioral economics relies on one assumption: people are idiots. People will often make poor choices and pursue self-defeating goals. Richard Thaler and Cass Sustein, both of whom have qualifications that go on forever, take this a step further in their book titled Nudge, and argue that by exploiting these quirks in human behavior, we can design far more effective incentives to, nudge people into making better choices. In other words, I'm here to suggest that behavioral economics may offer us our best shot to save the world. Let's see why. The first irrational tendency we find in people is herd mentality. We hate it, but we can't help it. We love to conform. In a study done on one particular neighborhood in California, residents receiving their energy bills from their utility companies began receiving data about the average energy consumption of their neighbors. Sure enough, residents above the local average started cutting back on the energy use in subsequent months. Unfortunately, so powerful is the desire to conform that people below the average did the reverse and started increasing their energy use. But here's the punchline. People stop conforming when they're recognized as being superior. In the next month, the researchers went back and drew in smiley faces on the energy bills of those who consume below average. The result? Everyone began cutting back. In other words, it may be time to consider bringing back incentive mechanisms that we thought could only work in first grade. The second irrational tendency we find in people is what's called status quo bias. People are lazy. In fact, they're so lazy that decisions can be literally made for them simply by changing what the default option is. Consider a coffee mug. How much would you be willing to pay for a coffee mug right now? Researchers have spent years studying this. In one study, a class of students was divided in two. One half of the class received mugs, the other half didn't. Some time was allowed to elapse. At the end of the study, the group with mugs demanded twice as much money to give up their mugs as the group without mugs was willing to pay to get one. Moral of the story, if I give you a mug, you're going to defend that mug. Now, imagine if companies were to offer a free trial period for energy-saving light bulbs. You get a trial of these light bulbs for 2 weeks for free, and after that period, if you like them, you have to pay for them. If you don't like them, return them for free. Chances are that if you bite the bait and accept the trial period, these light bulbs are going to be with you forever. The list goes on and on. But the point of all this rambling is that rather than trying to convince people to care about the environment through a complicated series of positive and negative incentives, new research suggests it might be easiest to use behavioral tools to achieve the same results at substantially reduced cost. In other words, we need to start getting creative. Well, okay. According to behavioral economics, one way to make us care more about the environment is to connect it to other aspects of our lives. So, at the beginning of the speech, I asked you to consider the plight of jolly old St. Nicholas. Not because you care about him, and certainly not because I care about him, but because as winter break approaches, some of our minds will nevertheless begin to dwell on him. When that happens, I hope you will consciously or subconsciously recall that global warming is out to get him by 2030. And hopefully, this will be enough to nudge all of us to go a little bit greener this holiday season.